The acquisition papers were already signed when Desmond Hale walked in. Everett Sloane's laugh came first. Sharp, careless. Someone suggested the service elevator. The silence spread in stages, conversations thinning like air leaving the room. But what came next destroyed everything Everett planned. The joke wasn't random. Desmond had testified in 3 infrastructure failures never publicly released: Reading supply strandings, Bakersfield driver fatalities, Ogden derailments. Everyone there had ignored his sealed reports. The invitation itself. Reconnaissance. The papers were dated 3 days before Desmond received it. The humiliation was never the point. The assessment was: drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before the room decides whether you can be managed or need to be contained. Because Desmond is about to walk into a conference room where the doors close on the last chance to ask what happens when dignity refuses to disappear quietly. The acquisition papers were signed 3 days before Everett Sloane invited Desmond Hale to the estate, which meant the joke had never been about humiliation. It had been about making sure the room saw him first as a target, not as the man who could stop them. No one bothered lowering their voice when they said it, because the assumption had already been made that the man standing near the entrance could not possibly be the person they were talking about. Everett's laugh came first, sharp and careless, the kind that fills space without asking permission. Someone else suggested that if the joke was going to be committed to, it should at least be done properly, and that maybe Everett should ask the guy directly whether he needed help finding the service elevator. The suggestion landed with the kind of casual cruelty that only works when everyone assumes the target won't understand what's being taken from them. Desmond had checked his phone twice in the driveway before stepping out of his vehicle, not because he was avoiding the entrance, but because Aaliyah had texted him a reminder about her permission slip for the Museum of Flight trip in Tukwila, and he'd promised her he would be home before midnight to sign it. He slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket, the fabric worn smooth at the cuffs, but clean in a way that suggested intention rather than apology. That was when he stepped fully into the light spilling from the dining room and said, evenly, that he had arrived through the front gate because the invitation had listed no alternatives. The silence did not arrive all at once. It moved in stages, a ripple that started near the long table overlooking Puget Sound and spread toward the cluster of donors near the windows facing Bainbridge Island. Conversations thinned first, voices trailing off mid-sentence as people turned to see what had shifted in the room. Then the laughter stopped. Everett turned, still smiling, the expression holding for half a second too long before it became something he could no longer control. His hand tightened slightly around the glass he was holding, condensation slipping down the side and pooling against his palm. He had been mid-gesture when he realized who was standing there, and now his arm hung suspended in a way that made the motion look incomplete, stranded between confidence and adjustment. Desmond did not raise his voice. He did not move toward the table or offer clarification. He waited, because the room owed him an explanation whether it wanted to admit that or not. Subscribe before you assume dignity is something people earn instead of something they refuse to surrender. The invitation had arrived that morning at the Regional Distribution Center in Kent, printed on heavy paper stock, delivered with no context and no apology. Only Everett Sloane's name and the address of this estate on Whidbey Island, where Washington State's wealthiest infrastructure donors were gathering for a closed-door strategy session. Desmond had read it twice before folding it into his pocket, because by then he had already learned that explanations usually arrived too late to matter. Everett was speaking now, too fast, words tumbling over each other in a cadence that suggested preparation but felt improvised. He thanked Desmond for coming, as though gratitude might erase the gap between intent and consequence. He gestured toward the table, offered a drink, mentioned something about inclusion that sounded rehearsed the moment it left his mouth. His watch caught the light as he moved, the kind of timepiece that cost more than 3 months of rent in Federal Way. He had checked it twice before Desmond arrived, timing something that no one else in the room had been told to expect. Desmond nodded once, declining everything else. He did not need hospitality. He needed the room to understand what had just happened. And the room, for the first time that evening, went completely silent. No one intervened. No one moved. The question hanging in the air was not whether this would get worse, but whether anyone present was willing to acknowledge that it already had. Everett's recovery attempt came too quickly, the words arriving before he had fully decided what they should accomplish. He gestured again toward the seating area near the stone fireplace, suggesting that Desmond might be more comfortable there, away from the main gathering, as though comfort had ever been the issue being negotiated. The phrasing was careful, each word selected to imply consideration without requiring accountability, the kind of language that fills space while avoiding the center of what has actually occurred. Desmond remained where he was, hands loose at his sides, posture neither defensive nor apologetic. He had not come here to make anyone comfortable. He had come because the invitation had been explicit, and now the room would have to reconcile what it had assumed with what was actually standing in front of it. A phone buzzed somewhere near the center table, the vibration sharp against polished wood. The man holding it glanced down, read something on the screen, then leaned toward the woman seated beside him and whispered without moving his lips much. She nodded once, her expression tightening in a way that suggested new information was being processed faster than it could be openly acknowledged. Whatever had just been shared, it was not casual. The woman reached for her own phone, thumbs moving quickly across the screen as she typed something, and sent it before setting the device face down on the table. The gesture was small, but it registered. People were no longer operating solely on what was happening in the room. They were confirming something outside of it. Everett was still speaking, his voice taking on the rounded cadence of someone who had delivered versions of this speech before, words about partnership and shared vision and the importance of diverse perspectives in infrastructure development. The phrasing had the texture of a press release, each sentence constructed to sound meaningful without committing to specifics. He mentioned a foundation, referenced a mentorship initiative that may or may not have existed beyond the convenience of this moment. Desmond listened without responding, his silence functioning as a kind of pressure that Everett had not anticipated and did not know how to deflect. The longer Desmond remained quiet, the more Everett's language began to buckle under its own weight. Then Everett did something that shifted the dynamic entirely. He stepped closer to Desmond, lowering his voice slightly, and suggested they speak in the adjoining study, away from the larger group, where they could have a more candid conversation. The offer was framed as courtesy, but the intention was containment. Everett needed the situation relocated, needed it separated from the audience that was now watching with a different quality of attention than they had been 15 minutes earlier. Desmond did not move. He did not refuse outright, but his stillness functioned as refusal nonetheless. The message was clear. Whatever was going to be said would be said here, in front of everyone, or it would not be said at all. That was when the woman near the back of the room stood. She did not make an announcement or offer an excuse. She simply gathered her coat from the chair beside her, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked toward the exit that led to the gravel driveway, where cars were parked in neat rows under landscape lighting. Her departure was quiet, efficient, the kind of exit that does not demand attention but receives it anyway because of its timing. She had been one of the people laughing earlier. Now she was leaving, and the fact that she had chosen this exact moment to do so suggested that staying had become untenable in a way no one was willing to name aloud. The room adjusted again. Shoulders shifted. Glasses were set down. Someone cleared their throat, but did not follow it with words. And then a voice came from the far end of the table, measured and careful, belonging to a woman whose posture suggested she had spent years in rooms where speaking too soon could cost more than silence ever would. She was looking directly at Desmond now, her gaze steady but not confrontational, and she asked, with the kind of precision that indicated the question had been forming for several minutes, whether Desmond Hale had once testified during a state infrastructure review following a supply chain failure outside Reading. The question hung in the air, specific and impossible to deflect. Desmond turned toward her, his expression unchanged, and said simply that he had. The woman's voice carried the kind of precision that only came from years spent reading testimony transcripts and legal briefs, where every word had been chosen for its ability to survive cross-examination. Her accent placed her somewhere in Marin County, the vowels shaped by coastal California in a way that could not be learned or imitated. She repeated the question, not because Desmond had failed to answer, but because she was giving the room time to catch up to what she had already understood. The supply chain failure outside Reading had involved medical supplies stranded during wildfire season, critical inventory that never reached evacuation centers in Shasta County, because routing decisions had been made based on cost efficiency rather than emergency protocols. Desmond's testimony had been clear, documented, and ultimately ignored by the investment group that controlled the distribution network. Desmond confirmed this without elaborating. He did not add context or offer interpretation. He simply acknowledged that the testimony had occurred and that the bottleneck she was referencing still existed because the proposed solution had been deemed cost-inefficient by stakeholders who did not rely on those routes to survive. The words landed without emotion, but their weight was immediate. Someone near the center of the table set down their fork, the metal striking porcelain with a sound sharper than intended. The rhythm of the room had changed. What had been a social gathering designed to reinforce existing relationships was now something else entirely, something that required people to remember things they had not expected to account for tonight. A man seated 2 chairs down from the woman leaned forward, his expression tightening as recognition surfaced. He worked logistics consulting for Franklin County, and he had seen Desmond's name before, attached to a safety brief that had circulated after a fatal overnight collision near Bakersfield involving a driver who had been on shift for 14 consecutive hours because the scheduling software prioritized delivery windows over federal rest requirements. The brief had recommended systemic changes. The changes had not been implemented. The man did not say this aloud, but his silence had texture now, the kind that indicated he was reevaluating decisions he had made in rooms far from this one. Another voice joined, this time from someone who had been quiet until now, a woman whose company had underwritten insurance policies for rail freight moving between Ogden and the Pacific Northwest. She mentioned a derailment, her tone careful, as though she was testing whether the room was prepared to follow this thread to its conclusion. The derailment had never been publicly reported because the cargo involved had been classified as low-priority agricultural product, but the investigation had revealed track maintenance deferrals that stretched back 3 fiscal quarters. Desmond had been interviewed as part of that investigation. His recommendations had been sealed in a report that was never released, not because the findings were inaccurate, but because releasing them would have required acknowledging a pattern of negligence that crossed multiple jurisdictions and implicated decision-makers who were still operating in positions of authority. A man near the windows, someone whose infrastructure consulting firm operated out of Sacramento County, exhaled quietly when the Redding testimony was mentioned, his expression shifting not to concern but to something closer to vindication, as though a position he had argued for internally was being validated by someone outside his organization. The room was no longer adjusting. It was recalibrating. This was not dramatic. It was worse than that. It was factual. The joke that had opened the evening had assumed ignorance, had relied on the premise that Desmond Hale could be reduced to a single image, a man who had arrived wearing the wrong clothes and could therefore be dismissed without consequence. What the joke had done instead was create the conditions for memory to surface, for people in the room to realize that they knew this name, that it had appeared in documents they had read, in hearings they had attended, in reports they had received, and then filed away because acting on them would have been inconvenient. Everett was still standing, but his posture had changed. His shoulders had drawn inward slightly, his jaw tight in a way that suggested he was calculating something he had not prepared for. He glanced toward the woman who had asked the first question, then toward the man from Franklin County, as though looking for an ally or a way to redirect what was happening. No one met his gaze. The laughter that had filled the room 30 minutes earlier felt impossible now, not because anyone had explicitly condemned it, but because the context had shifted so completely that returning to it would require pretending the last 10 minutes had not occurred. Subscribe before you mistake silence for agreement. Everett realized, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, that the room was no longer laughing. It was evaluating, and the conclusion it was reaching had nothing to do with the script he had written for this evening. The questions that followed were not aggressive. They were worse than that. They were careful, each one phrased with the kind of restraint that indicated the person asking already knew part of the answer and was testing whether Desmond would confirm what they suspected or offer something that contradicted the version they had been told. A man near the windows, someone whose company managed freight contracts for Multnomah County, asked whether the scheduling software Desmond had referenced in the Bakersfield brief was still in active use across West Coast distribution networks. Desmond said that it was, and that the federal arrest requirement violations flagged in that incident had been categorized as isolated rather than systemic, which meant the software had never been audited beyond the single route where the collision occurred. The man nodded slowly, his fingers drumming once against the stem of his wine glass before going still. He did not ask a follow-up question. He did not need to. The answer had confirmed something that would require him to make decisions later, in offices far from this estate, about contracts he had signed and liability he had assumed without fully understanding what he was inheriting. Someone else asked about the Ogden derailment, specifically whether the track maintenance deferrals had been limited to that section of the line or whether they extended into Idaho and eastern Washington. Desmond answered that the investigation had identified deferred maintenance across 400 miles of track, but that the report had only examined the 70-mile stretch where the derailment occurred because expanding the scope would have required coordination between state agencies that were not willing to share jurisdiction. The answer was technical, but its implications were not. It meant that the problem was larger than anyone in the room had been told, and that the decision to contain the investigation had been deliberate. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the silence that had greeted Desmond's arrival. That silence had been shock. This silence was calculation. People were no longer reacting to what was happening in front of them. They were thinking about what it meant for things that had already been set in motion, contracts that had been signed, policies that had been approved, investments that had been justified using data that was now being reframed as incomplete or selectively presented. The air felt heavier, not with tension, but with the weight of consequences that had not yet been named, but were becoming impossible to ignore. Everett had stopped trying to redirect the conversation. He stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on the stone mantel, his posture suggesting casualness, but his knuckles pale where they pressed against the surface. He was listening now, not as a host, but as someone who was beginning to understand that the situation had moved beyond his ability to contain it. His gaze moved between Desmond and the other guests, searching for an opening, a way to reclaim the narrative. But every time he seemed ready to speak, another question was asked, and the moment passed. Then Desmond saw it. Everett's attention shifted toward the far end of the table, toward the man from Franklin County who had recognized Desmond's name earlier. Everett caught his eye and tilted his head slightly toward the adjoining hallway, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. The man hesitated, then set his napkin on the table and stood, moving toward the exit with the kind of practiced neutrality that suggested he had participated in backroom conversations before and knew how to leave a room without drawing attention. Everett followed a moment later, his movements deliberate, as though he was excusing himself for something routine rather than something urgent. Desmond watched them disappear into the hallway, understanding immediately what was happening. The conversation was being relocated, moved into a space where it could be controlled, where decisions could be made without witnesses and agreements could be reached without the complication of accountability. He had seen this before, in boardrooms and conference calls and closed-door meetings where the real negotiations happened after the formal discussions ended. Staying in this room meant becoming the subject of whatever was about to be decided in that hallway. He did not announce his departure. He simply turned toward the terrace doors, the glass reflecting the firelight and the faces of people who were still seated, still processing, still calculating what they had just learned. The night air beyond the doors was dark and cool, and the sound of the water below the bluff was steady and indifferent. Desmond stepped outside, and the door closed softly behind him. The terrace was empty except for the sound of the water moving against the bluff below, rhythmic and indifferent to everything happening in the rooms behind him. The air smelled like salt and cedar, cold enough that Desmond could see his breath when he exhaled, the vapor dissipating quickly in the breeze coming off Puget Sound. Lights from the ferries threading between Clinton and Mukilteo blinked in steady intervals, their paths predictable and unchanged by the fact that somewhere above them, in rooms filled with people who controlled millions of dollars in infrastructure investment, a conversation was being held that would determine outcomes Desmond could not yet see. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, the screen bright against the darkness, and saw Aaliyah's name. He answered before the second ring. She wanted to know if he had signed the permission slip. Her voice carried the kind of urgency that only existed in the gap between a child's need for certainty and the adult world's insistence that some things could wait. The field trip to the Museum of Flight in Tukwila was scheduled for Thursday, and Ms. Reeves had said that anyone without a signed form by Wednesday morning would have to stay in the library during the trip. Aaliyah had already told her friend Janae that they were going to see the space shuttle trainer together, and she could not be the one who had to stay behind because her father had forgotten. Desmond told her he had signed it that morning before leaving for work. He told her it was in her backpack, in the front pocket where she kept her lunch money. He could hear her moving through the apartment, the sound of a zipper opening, paper rustling, and then her small exhale of relief when she found it. She thanked him, her tone shifting immediately from worry to something lighter, and then asked when he would be home. He told her soon, that he was finishing something and would be back before she needed to go to bed. She said okay, but reminded him that she wanted to show him the diagram she had drawn of the Apollo command module before she forgot where all the parts went. He told her he would look at it as soon as he got home. He told her to brush her teeth and finish her reading. She said she would, and then the line went quiet for a moment before she said goodnight in a way that suggested she was already thinking about something else, already moving forward into the next part of her evening. The call ended. Desmond slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood there for a moment longer, watching the ferries move across the water. The world below the bluff was still functioning, still operating on schedules and commitments that had nothing to do with what was happening inside the estate. People were going home. Shifts were changing. Lights were coming on in houses along the shoreline. For just a moment, the night felt ordinary again. Then he heard the door behind him open, and the sound of voices spilled out onto the terrace, sharp and immediate, before the door closed again and the noise disappeared. The calm had been temporary, and now it was over. 2 days passed before the second envelope arrived, and by then Desmond had already returned to the rhythm that defined most of his weeks. Early mornings at the regional distribution center in Kent. Night crews rotating freight between Yakima, Medford, and Stockton. Schedules built around delivery windows that accounted for weather delays and border inspections and the unpredictable failures of aging infrastructure that no one wanted to fund properly. The estate on Whidbey Island felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else, a story he could recount if asked, but one that did not require immediate processing. He had told Aaliyah about the fairy lights and the cold air on the terrace, about how sometimes adults gathered in expensive rooms to talk about things that should matter but often didn't. She had asked if he was going back. He had said no. The envelope was waiting on his desk when he arrived Thursday morning, placed there by someone from the front office who had signed for it, but had not opened it because the law firm's return address suggested content that required privacy. The paper was heavy, the kind that communicated expense before a single word was read. Desmond opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside and scanning the first paragraph before his attention sharpened, and he read it again, slower this time, making sure he understood what was being communicated and what was being left deliberately vague. Everett Sloan's holding group had initiated proceedings to acquire a controlling interest in the logistics operation Desmond worked for. The language was technical, wrapped in terms like risk mitigation and operational consolidation and reputation management, but the intent was clear enough once the phrasing was stripped away. The acquisition had been structured to appear voluntary, framed as a partnership that would provide capital investment and strategic oversight in exchange for decision-making authority over routing priorities, staffing policies, and vendor relationships. The letter did not specify a timeline, but it referenced discussions that had already occurred, agreements that had been reached in principle, and due diligence processes that were currently underway. None of this had been disclosed to the staff. None of it had been mentioned during the meeting on Whidbey Island. Desmond set the letter down on the desk, the paper catching the fluorescent light overhead in a way that made the embossed letterhead stand out more sharply. The warehouse floor beyond his office window was already active, forklifts moving pallets toward loading bays, drivers checking manifests before pulling out onto the highway that would take them south through Tacoma and east toward Spokane. The operation functioned because people showed up and did the work that needed doing, not because investors in Manhattan had decided it aligned with their portfolio strategy. And now that work was being reframed as something that required external management, as though the people who had built it and sustained it were incapable of understanding what they had created. He thought about the room on Whidbey Island. He thought about Everett's laugh, about the joke that had been spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear, about the assumption that Desmond would either leave or accept the humiliation without challenging it. He thought about the silence that had followed, The way the room had shifted once people began remembering his name, once the narrative had moved beyond what Everett had prepared for. And then he thought about the timing. The acquisition papers had been dated 3 days before the invitation was sent. 3 days. Which meant the joke had never been a lapse in judgment. It had been reconnaissance. The invitation had served a purpose. It had put Desmond in a room where people could see him, could assess whether he was someone who would comply quietly or someone who would need to be managed more carefully. The humiliation had been deliberate, designed to test his response, to see whether he would internalize the insult or push back against it. And when he had pushed back, when the room had begun to recognize who he was and what he knew, the calculation had shifted. The acquisition was not a business decision. It was containment. It was a way to ensure that the variable that refused to behave as expected could be controlled before it became a problem that required more expensive solutions. Everett's silence at the end of the evening, his retreat into the hallway with the man from Franklin County, had not been about damage control. It had been about finalizing next steps. The room had provided data. The acquisition would provide leverage. Subscribe before you realize the room was never about proving you wrong. It was about deciding whether you could be managed. Desmond understood now that the people at that estate had not been surprised by what he knew. They had been assessing whether what he knew would remain theoretical or whether it would become actionable. The letter offered a meeting. Neutral ground, Portland, the following week. Federal Transportation Observer confirmed. Everett Sloan would be present. Desmond was invited, formally this time, as a stakeholder whose input would be valued during the transition process. The language was polite, professional, and entirely calculated to obscure the fact that refusal was not actually an option being offered. He folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Outside, a truck engine turned over, the diesel rumble cutting through the ambient noise of the warehouse. The day was starting, and it would continue whether or not he had just learned that the ground beneath him had been shifting long before he realized he was standing on it. The story had never been about embarrassment. It had been about identifying a variable that refused to behave as expected and then deciding what to do about it. The changes started small, the kind that could be dismissed as coincidence if they happened in isolation, but accumulated into a pattern once they began repeating. On Friday afternoon, Desmond's regional manager, a man named Victor Brennan who had worked freight logistics for 30 years and understood the difference between operational necessity and corporate interference, stopped by the office to mention that corporate had requested updated personnel files for all supervisory staff. The request was framed as routine, part of a quarterly compliance review, but the timing suggested otherwise. Victor delivered the message with his usual efficiency, but his expression carried something else, a tightness around his eyes that indicated he had already connected the dots Desmond was still assembling. By Monday, the email traffic had shifted. Messages that used to come directly to Desmond now copied additional recipients, people from departments he did not normally interact with, addresses that ended in domains he did not recognize. The language in those emails remained professional, but the structure had changed. Decisions that Desmond had been authorized to make independently for the past 4 years now required secondary approval from someone in the Alameda County office, whose name he had never seen on an organizational chart. The delays were minor, measured in hours rather than days, but they created friction where none had existed before, small interruptions that forced him to justify choices he had been trusted to make without explanation. Wednesday brought another shift. A route adjustment request that Desmond had submitted 2 weeks earlier, one that would reduce overnight driving hours between Modesto and Redding by rerouting through Sacramento County instead of cutting straight through the valley, was returned with a note indicating that the proposed change did not align with current efficiency targets. The note did not specify what those targets were or who had established them. It simply stated that the adjustment was being declined pending further review. Desmond read the message twice, recognizing the language as the kind that appeared when decisions were being made by people who did not understand the systems they were managing but had been given authority to manage them anyway. The Modesto route was the same one that had been flagged in a safety audit 18 months earlier, the same one where driver fatigue had been documented as a recurring issue during peak shipping periods. The adjustment Desmond had proposed was not experimental. It was the solution that should have been implemented the first time the problem was identified. And now it was being declined, Not because it was flawed, but because someone had decided that efficiency mattered more than the circumstances that made efficiency dangerous. He called Victor's office, got voicemail, and left a message asking for clarification. Victor called back an hour later, his tone careful in a way that suggested he was choosing his words with more precision than usual. He said that the route adjustment had been flagged by someone in risk assessment, someone who had concerns about reputational exposure if operational changes were implemented without consulting the legal team that was currently reviewing the acquisition proposal. The phrasing was deliberate, designed to make it sound like Desmond's judgment was being questioned without explicitly stating that Desmond's judgment was the problem. Subscribe before you watch systems rewrite your credibility in real time. The message was clear. Desmond's professional authority, the same authority that had been built over years of documented decisions and reliable outcomes, was being reframed as a liability. The room on Whidbey Island had surfaced his history, had reminded people that he was someone who testified, who flagged problems, who refused to accept cost efficiency as justification for preventable failures. And now that history was being recontextualized as risk, as something that required management oversight rather than something that should inform management decisions. Thursday afternoon, Desmond received a formal calendar invitation. The meeting in Portland had been scheduled for the following Tuesday, 10 o'clock, in a glass tower on Southwest 5th Avenue that housed law offices and financial consultancies and the kind of conference rooms where decisions were finalized after being discussed elsewhere. The invitation listed 5 attendees: Everett Sloan, a representative from Multnomah County Transit Authority, a federal transportation observer based in Denver, Victor Brennan, and Desmond Hale, identified in the subject line as a stakeholder whose participation was required for procedural compliance. The language was neutral, bureaucratic, and entirely calculated to obscure the fact that this was not a consultation. It was a negotiation where the terms had already been decided, and Desmond's role was to confirm that he understood what was being offered and what would happen if he chose not to accept it. He printed the invitation and placed it in the folder next to the acquisition letter. Outside, the freight yard was shifting into evening operations, trucks lining up at the gates, drivers checking their routes one last time before heading out onto highways that stretched south through Oregon and east through Idaho, carrying goods that people needed and rarely thought about until they did not arrive. The meeting was 5 days away, and the ground was still shifting. The building on Southwest 5th Avenue had been photographed for architectural magazines, its glass facade designed to reflect the sky in a way that made it appear lighter than its actual mass. A 40-story structure that contained law firms and investment consultancies and corporate offices where decisions affecting thousands of people were made in conference rooms with views that extended across the Willamette River toward Mount Hood. The meeting was scheduled for the 14th floor, in a suite that belonged to a firm whose name Desmond did not recognize, but whose client list, according to a quick search he had run during his lunch break, included transportation authorities in 6 western states and a federal oversight committee that reviewed infrastructure compliance across the Pacific Northwest. The email confirming the details had arrived Friday evening, after business hours, which meant it had been sent deliberately at a time when immediate questions would have to wait until Monday. The message listed the attendees again, this time with titles that had not been included in the calendar invitation: Everett Sloan, Principal, Sloan Infrastructure Holdings; Catherine Marsh, Deputy Director, Multnomah County Transit Authority; Raymond Torres, Federal Transportation Observer, Region 8, Denver Field Office; Victor Brennan, Regional Operations Manager; and Desmond Hale, Stakeholder Representative. The phrasing was careful, each title selected to convey authority or compliance, depending on who was reading it. Desmond's designation as Stakeholder Representative was particularly revealing. It suggested participation without power, input without decision-making authority, a role designed to satisfy procedural requirements while ensuring that the outcome remained unchanged. The email included an agenda. The first item was introductions, which would take 10 minutes. The second item was a review of operational integration timelines, which would take 20. The third item was stakeholder input, which had been allocated 15 minutes, a duration that communicated exactly how much weight that input was expected to carry. The fourth and final item was next steps, which had no time limit listed, suggesting that this was where the actual decisions would be made after the formalities had been observed. Desmond printed the email and placed it in the folder with the other documents. The acquisition letter and the calendar invitation and the route adjustment rejection that had arrived Wednesday with language about efficiency targets and reputational risk. The folder was getting thicker, each piece of paper a marker of how quickly a situation could shift from theoretical to unavoidable. He had not yet responded to the meeting confirmation. The email had included a line requesting acknowledgement of receipt and confirmation of attendance, phrased as though this were optional, as though declining were a choice that would not carry consequences that extended beyond the meeting itself. Victor had called him Saturday morning, early enough that Desmond knew the call was not casual. Victor said that corporate had asked him to confirm that Desmond would be attending the Portland meeting, that his presence was considered essential for the procedural integrity of the transition process. The phrasing was Victor's way of communicating something he could not say directly, that Desmond's attendance was not actually optional, that refusal would be interpreted as noncompliance, and that noncompliance would provide justification for decisions that were already being discussed in rooms Desmond was not part of. Victor did not ask whether Desmond planned to attend. He asked whether there was anything Desmond needed in order to attend, which was a different question entirely. Desmond had thanked him and said he would confirm by Monday. Victor had paused before ending the call, the silence lasting just long enough to suggest he wanted to say something else, something that would not fit within the boundaries of a professional conversation, before he simply said that he would see Desmond on Tuesday and disconnected. The irony was not lost on Desmond. The first invitation had been designed to humiliate, to place him in a room where he would be seen as something he was not, where his presence could be dismissed as a mistake or an intrusion. This invitation was different. It acknowledged who he was, used his professional credibility as justification for his inclusion, framed his participation as necessary rather than incidental. But the purpose was the same. Both invitations were about control. The first had tested whether he could be humiliated into compliance. The second was testing whether he could be formalized into it. He had not responded yet. The confirmation email sat in his inbox, unanswered, while the clock moved steadily toward Tuesday morning. Subscribe before the meeting decides what happens when you refuse to disappear quietly. Outside, the freight yard operated under the cold clarity of halogen lights, trucks moving in patterns that had been established long before anyone decided those patterns needed external management. The meeting was 4 days away, and Desmond still had not confirmed he would attend. Desmond left the distribution center just after 9, later than he had planned, but earlier than the shift supervisors who would stay until the last truck cleared the gates and the yard went quiet except for the security lights that stayed on through the night. The drive back to Federal Way took him through Auburn first, then Sumner, small cities that existed in the spaces between larger ones, places where people lived because rent was cheaper and commutes were manageable and the schools were decent enough that children could grow up without the weight of urban density pressing down on every decision. The roads were mostly empty, a few cars heading in the opposite direction, their headlights brief and then gone. He passed the rail yard near Auburn, where freight cars sat waiting for morning crews, their shapes dark against the glow from the industrial park beyond. The night crews were changing over as he drove, third shift coming in to replace second, men and women pulling into parking lots and clocking in for hours that would stretch past midnight and into the early morning when most people were still asleep. Desmond had worked those shifts when Aaliyah was younger, before he had enough seniority to request days that aligned better with her school schedule. He remembered the particular fatigue that came with that kind of work, the way time moved differently when the sun was not there to mark its passage, the way routines became something you relied on because everything else felt suspended. The people working those shifts tonight would finish their hours and go home and sleep through the afternoon and then come back and do it again, not because the work was fulfilling, but because it was necessary, and because necessity did not wait for better options to present themselves. He thought about the meeting. He thought about the conference room on the 14th floor, the agenda that had been carefully structured to allocate just enough time for his input to satisfy procedural requirements without allowing enough time for that input to change anything. He thought about Everett Sloan, who would sit across the table with the same expression he had worn on Whidbey Island before the room had started remembering things he had not accounted for. He thought about the Federal Observer from Denver, whose role was to ensure compliance with regulations that had been written to prevent exactly the kind of consolidation that was about to be formalized anyway. And he thought about Victor, who would be there not because he supported what was happening, but because refusing to be there would cost him more than participating. Systems had a way of containing variables. That was their function. They established boundaries, created processes, defined acceptable ranges of behavior and response. When something fell outside those ranges, the system adjusted, not by changing its structure, but by redefining the variable until it fit within parameters that could be managed. Desmond had spent his career working inside systems, understanding their logic, identifying their failures, proposing corrections that usually went unimplemented because implementing them would require admitting that the system had been designed with flaws that benefited the people who controlled it. The meeting in Portland was not about collaboration. It was about ensuring that the variable remained contained. When he reached the apartment, the lights were off except for the lamp in the living room that Aaliyah always left on when she was waiting for him to come home. He unlocked the door quietly, stepping inside and setting his keys on the counter before moving through the small hallway toward the living room. She was asleep on the couch, her backpack still on the floor beside her, a book open across her chest to a page she had not finished. The book was about marine biology, something she had checked out from the school library because she had decided she wanted to learn about deep-sea ecosystems where light did not reach and creatures had adapted to conditions that would kill everything else. He lifted the book carefully and set it on the table, then covered her with the blanket that had been folded over the back of the couch. She stirred slightly, but did not wake. Her science project was on the kitchen counter, the diagram of the Apollo command module she had drawn with careful attention to the placement of instruments and controls, each part labeled in handwriting that was still learning how to stay consistent. He looked at it for a long moment, thinking about how much effort she had put into getting the details right, about how she trusted that accuracy mattered even when no one was checking. Morning was 6 hours away. The meeting would happen whether or not he had decided how to approach it. Subscribe before the system decides your refusal was never an option. But the night was still here, and Aaliyah was still asleep, and for now the apartment was quiet in a way that felt separate from everything waiting on the other side of tomorrow. He sat down in the chair across from the couch and stayed there, watching her breathe, thinking about systems and the people who refused to fit inside them, and what happened when refusal stopped being theoretical. The drive to Portland took 2 hours, the highway cutting south through Tacoma and Olympia before crossing into Oregon near Kelso, where the Columbia River marked the state line and the landscape shifted from dense evergreen forests to broader valleys that opened toward the coast. Desmond had left before dawn, the apartment still dark when he closed the door behind him, Aaliyah's breathing steady from her bedroom, where she would sleep for another hour before her alarm went off, and the morning routine began without him. He had left a note on the counter next to her permission slip, telling her he would call that afternoon, that he would be home for dinner, that she should remember to bring her science project to school because presentations were starting Thursday. The city came into view gradually, the skyline rising against the pale morning light, glass towers reflecting clouds that had not yet burned off. Portland moved at a different pace than Seattle, quieter in some ways, more deliberate, a city that had grown around rivers and bridges rather than expanding outward from a single dense core. Desmond took the exit onto Southwest 5th Avenue and followed it north toward the address listed in the meeting confirmation, the streets filling with early traffic as people made their way to offices and coffee shops and the routines that defined weekday mornings in cities that had learned how to function without ever fully waking up. The building was taller than he had expected, its glass facade catching the light in a way that made it difficult to see the floors above the 10th story. He parked in the garage beneath the structure, took the elevator to the lobby, and checked the directory mounted near the security desk. The law firm occupied floors 12 through 16. The meeting was on 14. He signed in, received a visitor badge, and moved toward the bank of elevators that served the upper floors. The elevator was empty except for a woman in a charcoal suit who pressed the button for the 19th floor and then stood in silence, her attention fixed on her phone. Desmond pressed 14. The doors closed. The elevator rose smoothly, the numbers above the door counting upward in increments that felt both too fast and not fast enough. The woman exited on 19 without acknowledging him. The doors closed again. 14 arrived with a soft tone. The hallway beyond the elevator was quiet, carpeted in a way that absorbed sound, walls lined with abstract art that had been selected for its inoffensiveness rather than its meaning. Frosted glass doors at the end of the corridor displayed the law firm's name in brushed steel letters. Desmond pushed through them and approached the reception desk, where a young man with carefully styled hair looked up from his computer and asked whether he could help. Desmond gave his name. The receptionist checked a list, nodded, and said that the conference room was ready, that the other attendees had not yet arrived, and that he was welcome to wait in the lobby or proceed directly to the room if he preferred. Desmond said he would wait. 5 minutes later, Victor arrived, his expression neutral but his handshake carrying a weight that confirmed what Desmond already knew. That Victor was here because he had been told to be here, not because he believed anything productive would come from it. They stood together near the windows overlooking the street below, neither speaking, until the elevator opened again and Catherine Marsh stepped out, followed by Raymond Torres, the federal observer whose presence was supposed to ensure that everything happened according to regulations that had been written to prevent consolidation but had been interpreted in ways that allowed it anyway. Everett Sloan arrived last. He moved through the glass doors with the kind of confidence that suggested he had been in rooms like this before, that he understood the script and his role within it. His gaze found Desmond immediately, held for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and then shifted toward the receptionist, who stood and gestured toward the hallway leading to the conference room. The group moved together, a small procession of people who had come here for reasons that were not aligned but would be presented as though they were. The conference room door was already open, the space beyond visible through the frosted glass. A long table, chairs positioned with geometric precision, windows offering a view across the Willamette River toward the east side, where the morning light was beginning to break through the cloud cover. Subscribe before the doors close on the last chance to ask what happens when dignity refuses to be managed. Everett entered first. Catherine followed, then Raymond, then Victor. Desmond stood in the hallway for one more moment, looking at the room where decisions had already been made and were now waiting to be formalized, where his role had been defined as something that would satisfy procedure without altering outcome. He thought about Aaliyah, about the diagram she had drawn with careful attention to accuracy, about how she trusted that getting the details right mattered even when no one was checking. He thought about the systems that had brought him here, the invitation that had tested whether he could be humiliated, the acquisition that had tested whether he could be contained, and the meeting that would test whether he could be convinced that resistance was not worth the cost. The room was full now except for the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one with his name on the placard in front of it. Desmond stepped forward. The door began to close behind him, and the story stopped one breath before consequence arrived.